Hi, I'm Mark Turner, and I'd like to share my thoughts about what makes Apple such an innovative company. In this series, I'll start out with a brief history of Apple, because you need some background to fully appreciate the challenges that Apple faced on its road to world domination. Then I'll reveal the secret sauce that gives Apple its mojo. And finally, I'll talk about the culture and processes that contribute to Apple's success. But first, a little background. Who the heck am I to talk about this? Well, I was an Apple employee for 16 years, from 1992 to 2008. I started writing engineering specifications and documentation for the hardware and software development teams. Then I moved into developer relations and eventually became this guy, the macOS Technology Manager, also known as an evangelist. The evangelist job is to encourage and facilitate third-party hardware and software developers to create their best products for Apple's platform. At the time, Apple's next-generation operating system, macOS 10, was still under development, and my job was to ensure that key products like Adobe Photoshop and Microsoft Office would not only run on macOS 10, but that they would be better than they were on macOS 9 or on Windows. Our team worked with every major developer to bring over 350 apps to macOS 10 on the day we shipped, March 24, 2001. Today, there are thousands of applications for macOS 10, and I'm proud to have played a part in that. As I'm sure you know, Apple is doing fantastically well now. It's one of the world's most admired companies. But it wasn't always this way. In order to understand Apple, you need to know a bit of history. And before you can begin to understand Apple's recent success, you have to realize just how far they fell. You can divide Apple's history into three parts. The early years, when two young guys started the personal computer revolution, the dark days when the company lost its way and nearly died, and the rebirth which began when Steve Jobs returned in 1997. Although I started at Apple in 1992, my relationship with the company began much earlier. I was lucky enough to attend the same high school as Apple's co-founders, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. At the time, Homestead High School in Cupertino, California, was one of only two Bay Area schools that had a computer lab. In 1977, Apple donated one of the early Apple I motherboards, hand-built by Steve Wozniak, and it became an instant hit among the geeks in the computer club. Like other early microcomputers, it was built for hobbyists, and some assembly was required. You had to supply your own keyboard, case, and power supply. But that little circuit board, with 4K of RAM and just 62 chips, was truly revolutionary. We'd been living with paper tape, teletypes, and punch cards, and suddenly we got this computer that could actually do graphics, sound, and other fun stuff. It was really cool. Later that year, the Apple II was released. It was the first true consumer PC, coming fully assembled and ready to use. With the release of the world's first spreadsheet application, VisiCalc, in 1979, the Apple II also became the first affordable business computer. Sales skyrocketed, and Apple's rise was nothing short of spectacular. The company's IPO in 1980 sold out in minutes. It was the biggest IPO America had seen since the Ford Motor Company went public 24 years earlier, and it created more instant millionaires than any company in history. Suddenly, Apple was huge. In just 6 years, it went from startup to a Fortune 500 company, setting a new record for growth. Although I had friends at Apple and loved the products, I didn't join the company until a decade later, after Steve Jobs had already been forced out by the man he personally recruited to run the company, this man, John Sculley, who was CEO from 1983 to 1993. Sculley had no experience in computers or technology, but he was hailed as a marketing genius for his previous job at Pepsi-Cola. He bought into Steve's vision of personal computing, but when sales began to lag due to competition from the IBM PC, their relationship became strained, and in a power struggle, both men tried to have the other fired. Sculley won, and Steve was stripped of his responsibilities. He left the company shortly after, selling all his stock except for one share. Besides ousting Steve, Sculley is perhaps most famous for this product, the Newton Personal Digital Assistant. It was a technological marvel and a colossal commercial flop. But Sculley's biggest failure was not keeping his eye on the ball, as the company began to lose money and market share in the early 90s. He also signed a contract granting Microsoft permission to use some of the Macintosh user interface elements in return for Microsoft's continued development of applications for the Mac. 8 years later, that contract cost Apple millions when they lost a copyright infringement lawsuit against Microsoft. Sculley was replaced by this man, Michael Spindler, in 1993. Spindler was an insider, having joined Apple in 1980. He cut costs, including R&D spending, reduced the workforce, and tried to refocus on Apple's core markets, education and desktop publishing. He even did the unthinkable and licensed the Mac operating system to clone makers. But he wasn't able to stop the flow of red ink. So he tried to sell the company to IBM, Sun, and others. Fortunately, those deals never went through, and after 2.5 years at the helm and overseeing a record loss of $740 million in the second quarter, Spindler was replaced by Apple board member Gil Amelio in 1996. Amelio was hailed as a turnaround artist, having rescued the chipmaker National Semiconductor. He had no experience in the personal computer retail market, but as an Apple board member, he was well aware of the financial challenges he faced. In fact, he rescued Apple by pulling off a $661 million bond issue that ensured the company's short-term survival. But he was clearly unprepared for the leadership challenge of reining in an undisciplined culture that defied all attempts at management. I'll talk more about leadership in part 2, but for now I want to point out that the basis for the infighting and lack of discipline that Amelio experienced was years of poor leadership that encouraged engineering teams to ignore management and set their own agenda. Faced with mounting losses, Amelio took out the axe and fired nearly 1/3 of the employees. But he couldn't solve the fundamental problem of how to modernize the Mac operating system. So he set out to buy one. At the time, there were really only 2 viable options, and both were controlled by ex-Apple guys. One company was called B, and it was founded by Jean-Louis Gasset, the guy that Sculley had appointed to run Macintosh development after Steve Jobs was ousted. BOS was quite advanced, but it was still incomplete and had no installed base. Nevertheless, Gasset wasn't going to sell his company cheap. Although B was valued at less than $80 million, Gasset refused Apple's offer of $200 million. A decision he probably regrets, considering that 5 years later, B was sold to Palm for just $11 million. Meanwhile, Steve Jobs' new company, Next, had established itself in the science and higher education markets with an innovative object-oriented OS based on Unix. Its biggest claim to fame may be that the world's first web browser and web server were developed on a Next computer in 1991 by a man named Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN in Switzerland. When he couldn't come to terms with Gasset, Amelio chose to purchase Next and its operating system for $440 million, bringing Steve Jobs back to Apple as an advisor. In July 1997, with the stock at a 12-year low, a second quarter loss of over $700 million, and a little prodding by Steve Jobs, Gil Amelio was ousted by the board of directors. Jobs became the interim CEO and began restructuring the company and its product line. With a net loss of more than $1.6 billion over the previous 18 months and a market capitalization of just $2.2 billion, Jobs had his work cut out for him. In the 12 years that Steve Jobs was absent from Apple, the stock peaked at $18. If you bought at the time of his departure and sold when he returned, you would have earned $1.78 per share, or 50% in 12 years. Is that good or bad? Well, that depends on your expectations. But IBM returned 173% in that same period, and Microsoft 325%. When asked by a journalist what he would do to save Apple, Michael Dell famously replied that he would shut down the company and give the money back to the shareholders. Flash forward to 2011. Today, Apple is the world's second most valuable company, worth over $320 billion. And Dell? Well, he's eating crow. But he's not the only one. Apple has gone from whipping boy to the envy of the industry. If you bought $100 worth of Apple shares in 1997 when Steve Jobs returned to the company, they are today worth $6,439, and we're in a recession. No other Fortune 500 company has delivered that kind of performance. Look at these competitors: HP, IBM, Microsoft, Google, all run by smart people. Billions of dollars invested. How come they didn't return 6,300%? Obviously, because it's hard. If it were easy, everyone would be doing it. But I believe the fundamental reason is that Apple has simply out-innovated the industry in product development, manufacturing, logistics, marketing, and sales. And they did it by instilling a core set of values from top to bottom. Which begs the question, can any company innovate like Apple? I don't think so. Because it's hard, and it takes a level of commitment that most companies are unwilling to make. But that's good, because it leaves room for the innovators to succeed. And you can be one of those innovators if you're willing to dedicate yourself and your organization to developing the same qualities that Apple and other leading innovators embody. And that's the subject of Part 2, the secret sauce that powers Apple's innovation engine. Thanks for listening. I look forward to your comments via email or Twitter.